Hey everybody, welcome to our webinar on climate change fact or fiction. My name is Bob Brinkmann and I'm a professor at Hofstra University where I work on issues of climate, energy, geology, and the broad field of sustainability. In fact, I'm the Sustainability Studies Director here. For 23 years prior to coming here, I was in charge of a big environmental science and policy program at the University of South Florida. So as you see, when we go later on in this program, we'll talk a little bit about New York and a little bit about Florida and the kinds of things that are happening in those places. So let's get started right away. So we are going to first of all introduce the broad issue of what sustainability is and a little bit about climate change. Then we're going to move forward to talk about greenhouse gas management and pollution issues. And then there'll be a few conclusions that I'll give. And then I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So let's go ahead and get started with the introduction to sustainability and climate change. If we look back with time, probably just a little bit about sustainability is one of the things that I always like to do is to put it into some sort of historical perspective. Some of you might remember the famous biologist, ecologist by the name of Aldo Leopold. He wrote the book called A Sand County Almanac in 1949 that really starts us on the trajectory to understanding what sustainability is all about. The most important thing related to that is that he developed the idea of environmental ethics and also that there were real limits to the kinds of activities that humans could have on the landscape. Up until that time, we felt we could do anything. It was the time of possibilities. But in reality, we knew, through the work of Aldo Leopold, we understood that there were some limits to what we could really do. Then let's go forward on into Rachel Carson. Many of you probably are familiar with her work in the New York area. She wrote a book called Silent Spring. She was a famous author who brought science to the general public. And what's interesting about that book, Silent Spring, is it dealt with the issues of environmental pollution and the impacts of industrialization on ecosystems. So she brought forward these ideas that we are polluting the landscape in ways that are harmful to us over the long term. And as a result of her work, it led to a lot of the rules that were passed in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Compared to a lot of leaders today, Richard Nixon would actually be considered a very green, very environmental president. It was under his watch that we developed the EPA, as well as a number of important laws such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. It was also another important person was Gaylord Nelson, who developed the first Earth Day. Some of you might be familiar with Earth Day as April 22nd. It's celebrated every year since 1970. And usually it focuses in on education and trying to promote protection of the earth. And all of these things happen in the 1970s with the passage of laws. And then in the 1980s, though, we started to realize that the rules that we had in our country were great. And in fact, we have even today some of the strongest environmental rules and regulations in the world, and we should be really grateful for that. I'm sure many of you have traveled around and seen other parts of the world and understand that we have a very clean environment today compared to a number of other countries. But we are impacted by decisions in other parts of the world. And that came out in the 1980s when we started to realize that issues of international concern were important to the world, and we needed to develop international agreements to try to solve that. If you remember, we had a problem back in the 1980s around the ozone hole. That was the first time that we really started to have these international dialogues about trying to solve these big, broad-based environmental problems. And there's somebody by the name of Gro Brundtland. She's the former Prime Minister of Norway, wrote a very important report called the Brundtland Report. It was published. It's also called the Report from the World Commission on Environment and Development. And it's in this report that we first get the idea of the concept of sustainability. This idea of sustainability was defined in that document, in the Brundtland Report, as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, it's kind of a complicated definition, and I always ask my students to redefine that. And one of the best definitions, I'm a pretty practical, plain-speaking person, and one of the best definitions that my students came up with is practical living to protect our children. So we are trying to find ways so what we can maintain our lifestyle without really harming the opportunities for future generations. And I think that's something that we can all appreciate, that we want to leave the world a better place. We want to try to protect the world for the future of our children and our grandchildren. In conversations around sustainability in the 1980s and 1990s, what happened is we started to move away from just that discussion around protecting the environment. Everyone recognized that that was an important thing. We want to preserve our forests, we want to preserve our waterways, we want to preserve our ecosystems. But we started to realize that we couldn't do that without having difficult conversations around economic development and social equity. And so more and more people brought in these ideas of fairness and equity in those discussions. And so we started to worry about other types of issues that were not traditionally thought of in the environmental community. For example, there's a very famous environmentalist by the name of Robert Bullard who started to work on issues of environmental justice and environmental racism. He was the first person to map around the country the location of hazardous waste sites, and he found that they were almost all located in minority neighborhoods or in lower income neighborhoods. And this idea of fairness, that who is impacted by the decisions of others, started to have a more global conversation. And we've seen this in the news reports. I'm sure you can think of this. We've seen, for example, hazardous waste that's transported to the deserts of Mexico where it's just left in the deserts leaking. Or we hear about this in terms of extraction industries, mining industries, that where companies will move overseas to take advantage of lax environmental regulations in other countries while we benefit from those products. So those kinds of things are worth having a global conversation about. So these other kinds of issues, the international issues, class, poverty, ethnicity, religion, all play a role in where we are going with this concept of sustainability. Currently, when we're thinking about sustainability, we have a lot of new things coming out since the 1990s. Obviously, we've had a number of important major disasters that have occurred and that have impacted our country. We had Katrina a few years ago. In our region, we had Sandy. I'm sure that we all have stories about that event. We also have the earthquakes, various earthquakes. The most probably interesting one and damaging one from a sustainability perspective is the earthquake in Haiti. But we also have other issues, and one of them that we're going to talk about today is this issue of global climate change. But other themes that emerge are things like, what do we do now that we're getting close or have achieved the peak oil? What do we do about our recent economic decline? How do we bring in these ideas of sustainability within that conversation? And then other questions about globalization and our broad consumer culture. I know that nowadays everybody wants so much. We all want our iPad, we want our computers, we want access to the internet. And most of us grew up in a much more simpler time. And the question is, can we all have those things? And if we all have those things, what are the impacts on the environment? We have kind of a throwaway society, fast culture, where fast fashion, where we will buy things very cheap, made all over the world, and not really care about them a few days later. And all of these things impact the environment in interesting ways that are part of this sustainability issue. And also the questions over the economic E of the three E's of sustainability. Remember, they were economics, equity, and environment. how do we maintain our economic strength as a country while trying to confront those issues? And I don't think anybody wants to go backwards in our economic progress, but we still are facing some very difficult issues. So all of this sounds great, but how do we do this? How do we how do we manage these sustainability issues? There's so much noise out there about how organizations or individuals are green. I love that one on the lower left, if you could see that, it says, I will at least consider a hybrid, where we feel good about doing things, but are we really doing things? And so what I always teach my students about is that sustainability is not that hard. It's really about measuring. How do we benchmark what we're doing today and shed light on new innovative ways to solve these problems so that we could change our culture? A great example comes to us on this issue from Germany. Germany, cloudy, dreary Germany. I'm sure some of you have been there, right? We know it's not, I spent 23 years in Florida, and it's definitely not Florida. But cloudy, dreary Germany about 10 years ago decided to try to get off of fossil fuels. They were worried about their reliance on other countries for their energy sources. They were worried about global climate change. And they decided to, by 2015, to get 30% of their energy from alternative sources. And they beat it. They do that today. And in fact, there are days, on nice sunny days in Germany, where they're over 100%, and they're a net green energy exporter. So if Germany, dreary, cloudy, industrialized, very strong economy Germany, the strongest economy in Europe, arguably, can do it, we can. But I want you to know that there are a lot of organizations working on these issues. We have a number of important things like the U.S. Green Building Council, where that group rates green buildings. We have the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, which benchmarks and measures sustainability at universities. ICLEI for local governments, that helps local governments try to reach and achieve sustainability goals. And then the United Nations works with countries around the world trying to measure and assess sustainability. So a number of organizations are working very hard on these issues. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background on the big world of sustainability, and I could go on and on about that, but we're really here to talk about this issue of climate change, whether or not it's real or not. And I also want to let you know, I want to talk about what we as a country are doing about it. So let's take a look at this issue of the greenhouse effect. We've all experienced this in our own life. The solar energy carries with it a lot of heat, and that energy can get trapped into particular places. That's the reason it's called a greenhouse effect, is that if you've all ever been at a greenhouse this time of year, here we're enjoying it's got 40 degrees, 50 degrees outside. But if we walked into a greenhouse somewhere, it'd be about 60 or 70. And that's because the sun's rays come in, heat up that air, but the heat is trapped by the building. And that's basically what happens with the greenhouse effect. We have the sun's rays come in, and there are chemicals in the atmosphere that will absorb that heat in the atmosphere. And we love the greenhouse effect because that's what keeps our planet warm. There are lots of planets that are frozen. If we went to the dark side of the moon, for example, it would be extremely cold. But these chemicals hold in the heat, which is great. The problem is that pollution is producing a lot of these chemicals, which are called greenhouse gas pollutants, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're producing so many of these things that it's driving the heat up because of the absorption of the heat in the sun. So what we have seen, if you look at this graph, this shows annual average temperatures over the last 150 years or so. And it also has a 5-year running average. And if you take a look at that, you'll see that generally there's been a net increase in the 20th century in global temperature. Now, the greenhouse gases that drive that are these: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Now, the ones that we worry about the most because they're in the greatest abundance are carbon dioxide and methane. Now, we're going to come back and talk about those in a little bit of detail in a little bit, but most of you probably know what the sources of these chemicals are. But if we look at, this is one of the famous hockey stick curves. Some of you might have heard about the gentleman who developed this. I just saw him and talked with him quite a bit in Tampa at a meeting last week. His name is Michael Mann. He developed this curve called a lot of people call the hockey stick curve because it's long and then it just jumps up at the end. This shows roughly about 1,000 years of temperature in the northern hemisphere. And he did this by using tree rings. Now, this was published a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. Or not quite 20 years, 10, 15 years ago. But for the pace of science now, it's been a long time since this was published. And he got a lot of flack for it. A lot of people felt that the science wasn't very good, and a lot of people felt that he overlooked a few things. And what happened to him is that he became a flashpoint in this conversation about, is global warming real? Is it not real? That kind of thing. And he's had his email hacked. He's been sued. He's been subpoenaed all over this one graph that he published straight out of graduate school. He didn't even think it was going to do anything, but it got all kinds of press. Well, since even today, he still publishes on climate issues, but there are thousands and thousands of scientists that have verified this by using other kinds of things besides tree rings. For example, if we look at cave deposits, speleothem deposits, you can see some of these climate change issues. And we know right now that we're the warmest we've been for many tens of thousands of years. Now, the danger here is that we are continuing to produce greenhouse gases, and we're just starting to feel the warming effects of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the models from all the climate scientists are showing that we could achieve within about 100 years or so a 4-degree increase of global climate change if we continue the way we're at, which is that red graph or the red line on that graph. If we are aggressive and go the route of Germany and other countries in trying to reduce greenhouse gases, we can mitigate those impacts. So we're still at the point where if we were smart, we could solve this problem. I have a lot of people in my family who are not believers in climate change. They're not scientists, and I always ask them, why do you think that climate change isn't real? And they just say, because I don't think it's real. I said, well, where's your science? And they don't have it. But the thing I always ask people who don't believe in it is, let's just say that all these scientists are right. Even though you might think it's wrong, it still makes sense for us to try to solve this problem. If you think that this is even a specter of possibilities, because if this red graph is true, the world will be fundamentally different within the next 100 years or so. We will see significant inundation of coastlines, altered weather systems, and on and on. We'll talk about some of those things in a few minutes. Okay, the question that everybody probably has in their mind is, why the cool weather this winter? It's such an interesting case. We've had that polar vortex that moved over North America. There are a couple of things I would say to that. First of all, it certainly has been cooler here compared to other parts of the world. But while we are cooler and moister with all the snow we've had, the other places around the world that are warmer and hotter. So it balances out a little bit, and we've seen that overall the world is maintaining very warm temperatures. The other thing that's important to note is there's a lot of research that's been going on lately about big global climate cycles. And what we've discovered is that the Pacific Ocean is part of about a 20-year cycle where there are currents, downwelling and upwelling currents that transfer heat into the deep part of the ocean. So as the Pacific warms, the surface warms, it's carried down at significant depth into the deeper parts of the water. Now, after about 20 years, that warm water starts coming back up. All the science is showing us that and people have been measuring this, the corals are changing in the Pacific because of this warming Pacific water. The science is telling us that warm water will start to emerge in about the next 10 years, further driving increases in global climate change. So overall, that's one of the major explanations why we're seeing a little bit of a cooler temperature. The other thing I want to point out is, yes, it's cooler, but it's not that much cooler. We are still seeing broadly significant global warming and global climate change this is from global mean temperature from NOAA, showing these increases since 1880, broad general trends, and those trends are still up. So while it's lower than we remember, it still is lower, or it still is warming overall. One of the most important documents that came out in the last several months related to global climate change is a document called the International Panel for Climate Change report. It just came out, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. It just came out in the last month, and it had several key recommendations. The first, and what they did is they reviewed papers from thousands and thousands of scientists, scientific reports, government reports, data, and they reviewed all of these documents and came up with some general conclusions. The first one of these is that human interference in the climate system is occurring and poses a risk for human and natural systems. The second one is that it's caused impact in natural and human systems on all continents and all oceans. And there's plenty of research to demonstrate this. And another major conclusion was that there's melting snow and ice are altering the hydrologic systems, impacting water resources. Then the fourth one is that many terrestrial freshwater and marine species have shifted their geographic ranges and seasonal activities, migratory patterns, etc. So these four are demonstrating significant shifts in natural systems. But we're also seeing impacts on human systems. It's altering crop systems, and we're seeing, a lot of people have said, well, I hope it warms up because then we'll be able to grow crops in colder areas. But what's happening is that the overall impact has actually driven down crop production, and we've seen more negative impacts than positive impacts. There's also differences in vulnerabilities from inequalities by development processes, so that, in New York, we were hit by a pretty bad hurricane, but we're pretty good at pulling ourselves up and pulling ourselves together, and we're partially because we have a really strong economic system. But other places are not as good at doing that, and so I think that there will see more of those inequalities from these major impacts. Now, I want to stress that all of this came about as a result of research done by thousands of scientists. And I always like to show this graph, is that for those of people who don't think climate change is real, there's only a handful of people who really reject global warming as a real thing. The vast majority of science has supported this. And it's always interesting for those of us in the scientific community to listen to the political discourse on this, because we've been watching this stuff for 10, 20, 30, in some instances 40 years about what is happening with global climate change. And so this idea of climate change denial is one that we're always confused about, because there's so much research showing these impacts that were discussed in that IPCC report. Okay, let's take a quick look at the major sources of greenhouse gas pollution. The first of these is carbon dioxide, and we know that the major source of this is the burning of fossil fuels. This is in the form of or fossil fuels like gasoline, coal, natural gas. And then, of course, there's methane. Methane is a natural gas that comes from the decomposition of organic matter. It's often associated with reserves of petroleum or coal. But the danger with methane, and it also comes from animal digestion, as we all know, but it is 25 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So if we have one molecule of CO2 versus one molecule of methane, methane has 25 times more potential to warm the atmosphere. And so that's why people are so concerned about the expansion of animal consumption of animals. We've grown many parts of the world that were vegetarian, places like India, places like China, are moving more and more into meat consumption. And so there are many more farm animals than there ever have been. And so the methane from farm animals is increasing significantly. And we also have a lot more humans on the planet, too. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about policy related to greenhouse gas pollution and global climate change. For many years, the oil companies and our energy companies overall were in a little bit of deceit and denial about this. And I'll demonstrate that coming up with a legal case I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But that's really changed a lot. And I'm going to just open up a web link here to show you the website of British Petroleum. Almost every major energy company now addresses climate change front on. For example, if you look at this website here, it says BP believes that climate change is an important long-term issue that justifies global action. Well, that's a big deal that these energy companies are now on board recognizing that it's a real issue and that we have to deal with it. Now, the challenge with these energy companies, though, is how do we turn that into action? And if we focus in, we know that a lot of energy companies are working on green energy initiatives. So let's look at greenhouse gas policy in the United States. We saw that the corporate world is kind of on board with addressing these issues. But let's examine greenhouse gas policy in the U.S. And I'm going to do this by talking about the evolution of U.S. policy from the courts, the legislative branch, and the executive, or actually the courts, the executive branch, and then I'll go on to the legislative branch. So I think it's worth going back in time a little bit. Many of you probably have heard about Kyoto. This is a map of Kyoto. The Kyoto Accord, which was an international agreement to try to deal with greenhouse gas pollution and problems. It followed up the very successful effort to reduce chlorofluorocarbon pollution, which was the main source of problem for the ozone hole. Now, we were very effective as a world in coming to agreement to solve it, but the Kyoto Protocol wasn't really all that successful. It was an international agreement that many countries signed trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The green shows all the countries of the world who ratified the treaty, and the red shows all the countries of the world who didn't ratify the treaty. And you can see the U.S., I always like to show that map, the U.S. did not ratify the treaty. And in some ways, I don't really blame our leaders back in those days for ratifying it, because it allowed emerging economies like China and India to continue to produce greenhouse gases without regulation. And what we've seen over the last decade is that China is now producing more greenhouse gases than the U.S. China is the leading source of greenhouse gas internationally. So the U.S. is often criticized for not taking a stronger role in greenhouse gas emissions, but I think it's a double-edged sword. We didn't do it, but I think that there were reasons why the U.S. was uncomfortable with signing Kyoto. But overall, Kyoto set very strong limits in reducing greenhouse gases in industrialized areas to reduce by 30-40% in some cases. So a lot of people don't think that there is a U.S. policy. Do we have a greenhouse gas policy or a climate change policy in the U.S.? And I'm here to tell you we do, and I'll review it a little bit. It was a little bit forced on us. We have to go back in time and recognize that our previous president, prior to President Obama, was an oil man. George W. Bush was was involved with the oil industry. His family was involved with energy production. And so the president at the time, President George W. Bush, wasn't really a strong spokesperson around these issues of global climate change. And so many organizations sued the federal government for using the Clean Air Act, saying that the U.S. government was not doing its job in saving the world from this problem of global climate change by regulating greenhouse gases. In 2007, Massachusetts, a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, the state of Massachusetts and others sued the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. And this is a relatively conservative Supreme Court at the time, but the Supreme Court sided with Massachusetts and said, you know what? The EPA has to regulate those greenhouse gases. And that started the EPA. Now, this was at EPA getting into the job of regulating greenhouse gases. Now, that started a whole cascade of events. President Bush at the time, after this case, started to talk about greenhouse gases and the problems of global climate change. And Republicans and Democrats started to become a little bit more concerned about this issue. Some other statutory law cases, under the Endangered Species Act, the federal government was sued over the protection of the polar bear, that the melting of the Arctic sea ice was causing a problem and that the government wasn't regulating these gases and it was causing difficulties for endangered species. Well, the Bush administration settled that case out of court and basically set up a preserve for the polar bears up in Alaska and in the Arctic waters. Another important case that was going on was suing. There were a group of folks involved with the fishing industry in the Pacific Northwest suing the federal government over the Clean Water Act. They were finding that one of the things that happens with excess CO2 in the atmosphere, and by the way, we're approaching over 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. Normal is much lower. And this excess CO2 causes the ocean waters in some particular locations to become more acidified, to become more acid. And so what has happened in the Pacific Northwest is that some of the waters have become significantly, have had significant increases in acid, so it inhibits the growth of shellfish and limits fisheries in that part of the world. So they sued the federal government for not regulating these waters because of the acidification problem. And they were clearly going to win, and the government settled that suit and is now starting to regulate, to develop management plans around these acidified waters. One of the more interesting cases, I think, and I'm sure some of you are lawyers who will understand the interest, why this case is so interesting, was a case that is still ongoing. It's the native village of Kivalina and the city of Kivalina versus Mobile Exxon et al. If the photo here is a little spit of land of a village of Kivalina. It's an Alaskan native village, and it's a low-lying piece of land. It's on a barrier island similar to what you might see as barrier islands here on our coastline in coastal Long Island or coastal New Jersey. What's different about this island, though, is that most of the year, it's packed with sea ice. The coastline is protected from the heavy winter storms and the fall and spring storms. But what's happened is because it's warmed so much in the Arctic, that village does not get the kind of protection from the ice any longer, and the island is eroding away, and many people have had to evacuate the island over the last decade. So the village sued all the energy companies of the world, basically, saying that you have to pay for our damages. And they sued these energy companies using a tactic similar to what we know from the tobacco industry, saying that the tobacco industry was hiding the impacts of their product on the public. That's how the famous tobacco cases were won. The native village of Kivalina and found documentation that showed that these energy companies recognized that global climate change was real, but that they were hiding that from the public or working to deny global climate change. At the same time, their internal documents clearly showed the issues of CO2 were driving this issue of greenhouse gas warming. Well, the judge in the case recognized that there was a problem. The judge recognized that there was some deceit and denial going on. But the judge said, basically, we are all using these products. We could all sue ourselves for the impacts of global climate change on the village of Kivalina. And the judge said, basically, it's too big of a problem that we can't, and we're all part of that problem, and it's unfair to hold something that we all use, a company that's producing something we all use, responsible for our difficulties in this case. This hasn't made it to the Supreme Court. Odds are it will. I don't know if they'll win or not, but it's something to keep an eye out for, the question of whether or not damages can be gotten. Just think about if we start to see significant sea level rise in places like Miami, who's responsible for that? Or even internationally, we're seeing that there are cases where low-lying countries that are poor are blaming the industrialized countries for their inundations. So you can see that there are issues. If we go on to the executive branch, we know that the executive branch has a great deal of power. They appoint the leaders of the EPA that set the agenda. And as I mentioned, President Bush wasn't really engaged with issues of global climate change until late in his presidency, whereas President Obama definitely has made it a priority, although he's not been all that successful in any kind of legislative wins. But what he has done is he has urged all federal agencies to try to reduce greenhouse gases. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act had a strong focus on green energy, and he said he would support climate change legislation. There's also the EPA endangerment finding that was started by President Bush, that was finished by President Obama, that recognized these issues of global climate change. And he also is starting to do rulemaking, or the EPA has done rulemaking to show that greenhouse gases, that the U.S. can regulate about 85% of greenhouse gases. In Congress, nothing has happened. There were a couple of bills that were put forward, but none of them passed. So the Congress hasn't done anything. So I'm just going to move ahead a little bit. So what's happened is that the leaders in global climate change is not necessarily at the federal level, but it's at the state and local level. And that has some problems, as we'll see. I want to talk a little bit about some Florida and New York efforts. And why look at Florida and New York? These are some of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the nation. Wouldn't make sense to look at a place like Vermont. Even though Vermont has all kinds of great things, it's not a huge greenhouse gas emitter. And back in the early part of this decade, or the previous decade, is Governor Crist, Charlie Crist, signed agreements trying to set greenhouse gas emissions to reduce reductions by 40% by 2025, and wanting to get emissions to 80% below levels by 2050. Also developed a climate action plan, and he urged all the various agencies to work on a number of key initiatives. But there were problems because this was at a time where there wasn't a lot of leadership at the federal government level, and it wasn't sure what support they would get. Plus, Florida's had changing leadership, where Charlie Crist, the previous governor, is very climate focused, but the current governor doesn't think that climate change is really real. So you have these changing policies at the local level, at the state level, because of a lack of leadership. So right now, the state of Florida is not doing all that much. Now, if I could go to the first link here on the New York, in contrast, I always like to show what's happening in New York when we talk about these things, is that New York is doing a tremendous amount on global climate change, trying to reduce greenhouse gases, trying to promote green energy. If we look at one more website, this is the state has also started a Cleaner Greeners community program, where the governor has challenged every region in the state to come up with a climate action plan to reduce greenhouse gases and to develop green energy. So here where we're at on Long Island, we developed a sustainability plan that is going to double the amount of green energy that is produced and try to promote energy efficiency and overall green energy reduction. There have been other important innovations as well, but for the sake of time, let's move on to just hit some summary and discussion, because I'm anxious to get your questions. First of all, just to go back to the early discussion on sustainability, is that we know that sustainability is an outgrowth of environmental science and policy research. This is not coming out of the blue. And it's focused with measurable successes. This is not a feel-good, tree-hugging thing. We want to measure our success within the idea of environment, economic development, and equity. And the purpose of this is to try to make the world a better place for future generations. We know that there are a lot of significant efforts at the local government, state, local government level, nonprofits, schools, and businesses. But it's not highly organized because of a lack of that federal leadership. And the changing leadership at the state level also makes local efforts more significant but more difficult to coordinate. And finally, I just want to show you the reason why this matters. I mean, I'm going to show you two maps for the worst case scenario out 100 years or so in global climate change. 6+ meters of inundation in Florida. It certainly covers most of South Florida. And then if we look at just 1 meter, which is another pretty challenging thing for us, we see that large areas of New York and the coastal New Jersey and Chesapeake Bay are also inundated. Now, I could tell you that as a geologist, we've been inundated many times in the geologic past over the vast time periods of the age of our Earth. But we've never really had a human-induced climate shift like this, and we're really at the brink of making some significant changes to our atmosphere and to our planet. And so the question is whether or not we have the courage to use the technology we have, to use the innovation that we have in our young people, to use the policy recommendations we have from our climate scientists and from our scientific leaders to try to solve this problem. So thank you. Well, let's go to East Northport.
Wouldn't it be better, given all the pros and cons of pollution and all, wouldn't it be better for us to encourage vegetarianism?
You know, that's a great question. I think that vegetarianism is a great idea. However, the thing that I always recommend people to do, as a way to just make, not everybody likes being vegetarian, right? Some of us like our meat, and some of us enjoy that. What I always recommend people to do is to take one day a week to not eat meat. That's been encouraged by a lot of people in the environmental community, something called Meatless Monday. And a lot of institutions will do that. Here at Hofstra, we try to encourage Meatless Monday on our campus, where we encourage our students to eat meat. And just what the question was, just for those of you at the other sites, the question was, would it be appropriate for the world to move to vegetarianism? More or less, that was the question. And I think as I said, I think it's a good idea. It's challenging to try to change. Food is such an important cultural thing, right? We just had Passover and we're having Easter coming up, and people like their Easter hams and their Passover pot roasts and things like that. So we changing that is difficult, but the more gently we can treat the planet through making choices like vegetarianism, the better off we'll be in the long haul. Thank you for your question. Lynbrook, any questions in Lynbrook?
Why are there so many conflicting opinions from professionals as to whether we're actually having global climate change?
That's a great question. The question was, why are there so many conflicting opinions from professionals on why we're experiencing global climate change? I would say there's not conflicting opinions among professionals in the climate community and in the geologic and scientific community. We might debate over, are we warming by 2 degrees or 4 degrees, but there's very little debate over whether or not we're warming. The debate is actually driven by people in the policy side, or people who have things to lose as a result of trying to deny global climate change. So that's one of the things that's a little frustrating for us in the scientific community, is to see that often it's poised as a debate, like there's a scientific debate. There really isn't one. So the thing I would urge you to think about is, when you see people talking about there's no such thing as climate change, see what their PhD is in or see what their degree is in, and really try to figure out if this is somebody who really knows what they're talking about. Because I really haven't met anyone in my profession in a long time that would say anything that this isn't happening. Massapequa, let's go to you. Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, we have 3 questions actually.
Awesome.
The first question is Canada wants to build a pipeline for oil from Canada to New Orleans. Are you aware of that, and is that dangerous?
That's a great question. Massapequa, for those of you listening at the other sites, Massapequa has 3 questions. The first one that they gave me was, Canada wants to build a pipeline from Canada to New Orleans. They asked if I was aware of this and whether or not I think it's dangerous. I am familiar with the pipeline. It's called the Keystone Pipeline. It's a very controversial project because they're trying to utilize oil that is trapped in something called the Athabasca tar sands. And they're up in Alberta. These tar sands it's sand tied up with a lot of tar. It's very environmentally damaging to try to get that sand out. So a lot of people in the U.S. are trying to stop this project just because of the kind of environmental damage that is happening from the extraction of the sands up in Canada, this oil from the sand in Canada. But that oil has to travel through the U.S. The argument made on the pro side, why we would want that pipeline built, is because it's a bigger oil pipeline and it's double-lined and a much safer pipeline. So from that perspective, who wouldn't want a safer pipeline, right? But on the negative side of it is it's a pipeline, and pipelines do break. There was just a famous pipeline break in Little Rock, Arkansas, using these older pipelines that are bringing this oil down to New Orleans right now. So it's definitely a debate that is very strong in the environmental community and in the public policy community. So far, all the signals is that President Obama is going to approve this pipeline. It had to be approved by the State Department. They've approved it. So odds are it will be built. It's question number 2 from Massapequa.
Okay, thank you. Was having a cold winter a good sign for the environment?
I think it was a good sign. I mean, there are a lot of good things about having that cold winter, even though I didn't enjoy it after being in Florida for 23 years. It was a little chilly for me. But, it's a good sign that there are some pauses that can occur in particular locations. But I want to stress again that we often get tied up with our own location. We think that just because we're having a really cold year, that all of a sudden global climate change isn't real. But other places are warm and hot, or dry, or some other kind of bad thing is happening. So I always like to say, just one year doesn't tell the whole climate story. But sure, yeah, it was a nice experience. Question 3 from Massapequa.
Okay, Yep, number 3. What can we do as a Bristol community to help the environment?
I love that question. The question was, what can we do as a Bristol community to help the environment? Especially, and I'd like to talk about it within this idea of global climate change. One of the things to think about is your own energy use. What are you doing to try to reduce energy consumption? Then I would also take a look at the Bristol organization, and I know it's a wonderful organization, but there might be some opportunities to work with the organization in doing things like promoting green energy or buying green energy credits, or even just educating people about the impacts of global climate change. You could plant some seeds, plant a garden, try to think about educating people around you about those issues. I think one of the things we don't take enough advantage of is our own social networks to try to encourage people to think about these issues. Our leaders need support to try to move us in the right direction. And I think anything that we can do to try to educate our family and friends about these issues is important. Thank you. North Hills, any questions?
Yes, we have a question. Do you think that our use of air conditioning has ironically contributed to global warming?
Yes. The question was, do I think that our use of air conditioning contributes to global warming? Any kind of use of fossil fuel contributes to global warming, and so yes, air conditioning definitely it does that. So if you can change your air conditioning temperature a little bit, or maybe use it a little bit later in the season, anything you can do on that end would be useful. Thank you. Westbury, any questions for us? Westbury, any questions?
Yes, I have one for you. Hello?
Yes.
I have a question. In the Pacific Northwest by Alaska, the waters up there are so full of nutrients that it attracts thousands and thousands of hump whales, dolphins, porpoises, and the orca whales every year. Now, where they are coming from is the food chain in that area being destroyed and chasing them over to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, the question was, we all know that in the Pacific Northwest there are some amazing animals, the humpback whales, the orcas, animals like that, and that they rely on the nutrients coming down from the Arctic and in the upwelling of the currents there for their food supply. Are we seeing any changes in that? There are changes. That part of the world is experiencing some significant temperature changes in the offshore waters. To date, it hasn't really impacted the nutrient flows in that system. So we haven't seen any migratory routes. I personally am not sure what is going to occur in that area as a result of those changes, but I know that changes are happening. So I can't be more specific than that. All right, I think that's it. So thank you all for your time. It really was a pleasure talking to you this morning. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on the Hofstra website. My name is Robert Brinkmann, and enjoy your day, and let's all try to do something green for our planet. Take care.